Hello, friends. So I wanted to check in today with this little flower I thought I would walk through with you. And if you ever if you ever make it to one of my classes, this is one of the little flowers that I teach for my beginners. So let's get started and we will go through some of the basic strokes. Excuse my arm, I'm trying to clean my brush here. We will go through some of these strokes and then we will go ahead and paint this cute little flower. And you can duplicate these. How cute would this be on a little card? You can buy the little cards at on Amazon. And you could paint a few of these if calligraphy is your thing. You could do that as well. So today I'm using 140 pound, 300 GSM and cold pressed paper. I've got my Winsor Newton paints, which I am going to spray with some water to activate. To let you know too, I have a little ebook I'm working on and it has all of these beginner's tips and supplies in there. So if you want to grab that, let me know. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to first go through thin and thick lines. I'm using my favorite brush, Velvet Touch Princeton number 8. I just love these. It's a round, so it has the ability to make these thick strokes, and it also has this beautiful little tip. And the Velvet Touch have a really nice feel to them. So I like that as well. So let's go ahead and grab our Winsor Newton. I'm going to start with Sap Green, which is this color right here. It's a pretty, kind of the normal standard green, but it's very lovely. So let's get that wet. I like to give my paint, when I'm painting, the consistency kind of like tea. So it's very movable, not too liquidy, and easy to put on the paper. So I get asked a lot, how do I know how much water to use on my brush? So when you are dipping your brush into your water and getting it wet, I always just scrape it off a tiny bit, not too aggressive, so that it's not dripping, and then I dip into my paint. So let's go ahead. We're going to hold our brush. The closer to the ferrule here, the more control you're going to have, and you just want to hold it lightly like a pencil. And normally for these thin lines, like we would use here for the stem and the little stem connecting to the leaf, you would hold your brush upright. Now, I'm not going to quite do that with that angle because then you can't see what I'm painting. So let's just practice some thin lines. You're going to have a very light pressure, so you can pretty much just use this little tip here. Okay, and I rest my wrist on my paper and I move my entire wrist across the paper. So let's start with some of these thin lines. Again, if you ever take a class from me, when I figure out how to do online classes, this would be the first things I walk you through. So very light pressure using the tip, and we're just creating these little lines. This is a really good practice when you're just learning watercolors, because you want to be able to strengthen that muscle memory and get the feel for creating these thin lines. So I would suggest in your own time, you do maybe a whole page of these and then practice doing some squiggles and keeping that light pressure. Okay, so I put a little more pressure there and just get used to that. Now we're going to go into a little broader stroke, and in order to do that, you're going to angle your brush a little bit more and apply a little bit more pressure. So it's going to look something like this. Now the more pressure you put, the wider the brush stroke. So let's just practice some of those. Again, I'm using sap green and my Princeton round brush. Okay, so you've got that down. Now let's combine them together and we're going to create what's called a compound stroke. So a compound stroke is your putting together, you're joining together this thin line and the thick line. I use this in all of my petals. I use it in my leaves. So it's an important stroke for you to practice. So we're going to start with that little bit of pressure on the tip, pull your brush, and then begin applying pressure. And then back up again, just like that. This can be a very challenging stroke if you're a beginner in watercolor, so give yourself a little grace there. So very light pressure, begin to apply pressure and pick up. So if you can see here, this is this exact leaf. You could, if you just learn this one skill, all your leaves can look like this. Okay? So let's practice that a few more times. So just light, pull, push, and lift up. Okay, so practice that in your own time. We're going to go ahead and move on here. These petals consist of what's called a C stroke, which is all I use in my painting. So if you can master these thick lines, these thin lines, and this C stroke, you can almost paint anything I paint. So the C stroke is using this compound brush stroke, which is thin, thick, thin, and we're just creating a C from it, okay? So starting at the top thin, beginning to apply pressure, and thin into the letter C. With this, you can create leaves, you can create petals. This just opens up all of your paintings to so much more. Now, I would also practice going the other direction. So thin, thick, and thin. Because as you'll see, one side you're going to be more skilled at. And just doing a whole page of these, okay? So thin, thick, thin, thin, thick, thin. As you can see, I'm a little better on the one side than the other. So once you have practiced that, let's put them together and we're going to create this little flower here, okay? So let me grab my brush. I'm actually going to grab my brand new, so excited, my Princeton round number 16. This is a bad boy. This is a biggie. So let me just get that wet. I've never used it before, so it's going to be quite springy and maybe even a little bit stiff. And this will be my first time using it, so let's hope I can use it skillfully. So I'm going to go ahead, we're going to practice this thin stroke for the stem. So let's get some water and again creating that kind of tea consistency. And then let's just create our stem. So look at this beautiful tip. So light pressure, moving my palm across my page. Okay, beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and do my little, since I've got this green on my brush, just some little stems there. And we'll come back to that after we paint our flower. And make sure you have your 2 waters. So I use one water to wash my brush, and then I use another one to rinse it, because watercolors are very transparent. So if you go into a different color and you've got any of that old paint on there, you're going to get a muddy color most likely. So let's start here. I'm going to draw the center of my flower here. And this is going to help me with the direction of my petals, because we always want to make sure our petals are pointing towards the middle of the flower. Otherwise, it's going to look a little wonky. Okay, so I'm going to use my favorite color, which is Quin Magenta. I will list these colors below too for you. And for my flower. So let's go ahead. Oh my goodness, look at how fun. Look at how much paint this big number 16 round brush is compared to my 8. How much fun is that? So let's take the tip of our brush and we're going to just point it to the center of this flower. Pull out a little bit, begin to start putting pressure and lift. So I've got half of my petal now. And then we're going to go into the other side and we're going to point towards the middle of the flower very lightly, begin to pull, start applying pressure, and there you go. Now I've got an awful lot of paint on my brush, so I'm just going to dab it on my paper towel. Okay, I'm trying to darken this so you can see what I'm doing here. So there's your first petal. Look at that. That is a perfect petal, and it's just a combination of your left and your right C curve, compound curve with a light thin stroke at the bottom and the top, and a little bit more pressure to create the middle. So let's go in again and make our second leaf. So I'm going to make sure I'm pointing in the direction of the center of my flower. I don't want to be pointing this way or that's going to look kind of funky wonky. So let's start with very light pressure, beginning to press in and lift. So I've got this beautiful half of my leaf. Now let's do the other half. Point, press, and there you go. How easy is that, you guys? I say all the time, if you just know these strokes, you can do this. If I can do this, you can do it. So I'm just going to get a little bit more paint, make sure it's not dripping, and let's start our next petal. So point, press, lift. Okay. Other side, point, press. Now I kind of made that leaf fat. I'm sorry, that petal fat because I didn't want to have a big gap there. Feel free to turn your paper if you need to. And then let's just pick up a little bit more paint and we're going to keep continuing drawing these petals. Point, press, lift. Okay, point, press, lift. And you can always just kind of touch up that. This almost looks like a cherry blossom, doesn't it? Because cherry blossoms have those big fat petals. I love them. So we're going to try and fit 2 more in here. Point, press, lift. Point, press, lift. Could kind of round that out if you like. Now, I always talk about playing with the values of your colors. So using a little bit more paint to water so you get this interesting look. And they're not all the petals are not all the same size. There you go. How adorable is that? And how easy is that? I hope you're following along. And let's just kind of tap in. Now my paper, because I'm using student grade paper, is not allowing the paint to spread. It absorbed it too quick. So normally when you're using better paper, this would spread out and create that beautiful magic, but I'm just going to help it a little bit with a wet brush. Okay, so we've got our leaves here. Let me now rinse my brush. I'm kind of an aggressive rinser, by the way. And let's create some leaves. Wait till you see how easy these leaves are. So it's going to be this type of brush stroke, which is thin, thick, thin to create these leaves, okay? So let's go into our green. Now this is pretty watery, so I'm just going to, you don't want it dripping. Now I dropped a little bit of water here, so I'm just going to pick that up. That's called lifting, by the way. I'll talk about that on another video where you lift the color to create maybe a highlight. Okay, so let's go back to our leaf here. I'm using that sap green, which actually I'm going to add a little blue to my sap green because I think that'll create a little bit of interest here. I love adding blue to my leaves. Okay, so we're going to point, press, point. Look at that, a perfect little beautiful leaf. Okay, other side, point, press. And I don't know if you can, left side is always a challenge for me. See, but the colors in here are beautiful. I put a little bit of blue on my brush and then I had that green. Here's another very simple little leaf. Just point, press, right? Just like that. Look at how easy that is. Ooh, I'm loving this brush, by the way. Thank you, Winsor Newton. And you could do a few more. Point, press, and come out. And let's just create a little leaf there. There you go. Okay, now I'm going to go back into my flower and I'm going to add in something in the center. You can use black, you can use yellow. I actually use, I don't use a black because it's a little bit too harsh for me. I use this Payne's gray, which is actually pretty black. If you look at it, it's pretty black. So I'm just going to go into the center. Now keep in mind, if your flower is still wet, which mine actually is a little bit, it's going to spread. So you can wait for it to dry, or you can just barely tap in. You'll see here in a minute. And make the center of your flower. Now, do you see what happened? That was because it was wet. So watercolors go where the water is. So it spread. Now, don't freak out. If you don't like that, take a dry brush and just pick it up. Just like that. Okay? So I hope this is something you will try. Play with these thin strokes, do a whole page of them, do the little bit thicker stroke, which is just you're going to be applying a little bit more pressure, and then try the compound strokes where you're going from thin to thick to thin, always moving your brush. One of the things I've seen students do is when they're working from thin to thick, they are not pulling their brush. So you're barely putting pressure for that thin stroke, but you're moving the brush. And then you just begin getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And then as you keep moving, you are picking your brush up. Okay, so practice that. So thin, moving the brush, applying pressure, and moving and picking up your brush. Okay, now for these petals, what we did, something a little bit different. We did the C stroke, which is thin, thick, and pulled around. And I didn't quite pull out this tip on the end of my petal because I wanted my petal to be rounder. So I just lifted up. So here's the other side of that petal. Point, press, and I just kind of lift it up. And if you want, you can go back in. Do another one of those. Point, press, lift up. Point, press, and lift up. And then you can close in that end if you want. And there's your perfect petal. This can also be a beautiful leaf. I'll show you one more leaf using 2 C strokes. So I'm going to switch out my brush because I'm running out of room here. So here is a beautiful leaf, just using that C stroke. So again, going into my paint, if it feels like it's really full, you can just dab a little off. Now, here's a leaf. Thin, thick, thin. Now you could leave the leaf just like that and it looks beautiful. But let's add in another side to that. Thin, thick. Now you've got a little bit thicker leaf. Now, if you wanted to make a leaf kind of fat, you could do that. Thin, thick, thin, thick. And there's more like a eucalyptus leaf. You can also, this is really fun. I do whole pages of these and it's relaxing, is I do grass, like long flowy grass dancing across my page. And that is thin, thick, thin, thick, thin. Look at how fun that is. I love those. I've done whole pages of those. Here's another one of those. Thin, thick, thin, thick, thin. Isn't that fun? Play with these. Have fun with them. Thin, thick, thin, thick. That is so beautiful. A lot of times when I go out hiking, I see these long grass pieces and they're waving in the wind, and that's what that reminds me of. So grab your paper, grab your paintbrush. I'd love to hear any of your questions or what challenges you most in playing with watercolors. It's all I've ever done, so it's very natural for me. But, you know, I hear a lot of people say it's a very hard medium because you don't have control. Sometimes, you know, depending on getting used to using that water and paint, it can kind of spread and do all kinds of crazy things. But practice will take care of that and getting used to your water control. So try this out, and I hope I see you again. And check out my Instagram and Facebook page if that's kind of more your thing. And I will talk to you all soon. Thank you so much for being here with me. Happy painting.